Hey folks, so I wanted to clarify a couple of issues related to our lecture on attention yesterday. And I felt like I would be doing you a really big disservice if I didn't try to really make an attempt to explain some of these concepts a little bit better. So one of the things that we're going to do is kind of go back and talk about attention's effects on the brain very, very briefly. So as I mentioned, attention will affect the processing even of those early visual cortical areas. And in particular, there are three different effects that we can find happen as a result of focusing attention. So as you can see in this figure, you will see enhanced neural activity based on what people are attending to. What you're looking at here are portions of primary visual cortex as well as extrastriate areas as one focuses attention from one thing to another. And you can see how attention is kind of modified from these items. Now, these items were presented outside of the fovea, so they're kind of like those peripheral cues that we saw with Posner's experiments yesterday. But I wanted to spend some more time talking about how processing is occasionally enhanced. And this occurs with respect to things like appearance. So if you focus on the top, so let's go ahead and look at this figure. We're going to start with figure A, the two gray squares. Now what you're going to notice is that if you focus on the square on top, the bottom square appears darker. Now I want you to focus on the bottom square. What you'll notice is that now the top square appears darker. So depending on what you're focusing on, it changes how you visually process and therefore perceive the stimuli. The same is true in the case with figure B. If I look at the pink portion first, or the peachish portion, the overlapping area looks more pink. If I focus on the bluer colored rectangle, now that overlapping area tends to look a little bit more blue. So attention modulates the different ways that we perceive stimuli. And then finally, as I mentioned, what we are going to find is that different brain areas are going to respond in different ways based on the type of stimuli that we get. So I mentioned that we have the fusiform gyrus that is responsible for processing faces. We have the parahippocampal place area, which is responsible for responding to pictures of houses and things like that. So if I present these binocular stimuli that I'm showing you up above, as you shift between those, you're going to see activity shift from the fusiform gyrus to the parahippocampal place area and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Now, one other thing that I wanted to focus on at the cellular level is the case of how tuning tends to change. So what you're going to notice, this is a particular cell of a monkey that is attending to a particular stimulus. Its location is kind of denoted by the diamond here, and it's focusing on this. But what you'll notice is that as attention has to shift to the item represented by the circle, you're going to see that that area of attention shifts, and it actually does include part of that diamond, which I think is kind of interesting. So I think we covered neglect pretty well. Let's talk a little bit about change blindness. So that case where we saw the video of a man in a particular shirt, and then in the immediate scene after, we see a completely different guy and a completely different shirt. And most people don't actually notice the difference. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you are flawed or that there are any particular problems with your attention. It goes back to that concept of a non-selective pathway versus a selective pathway. Now, with a non-selective pathway, which is what we're often doing when we have too much information to focus on, we're more interested in the general overview or the gist of a particular scene. So as long as the person is still male, it doesn't really matter so much that it's a completely different person. And the shirt doesn't really matter all that much either. So change blindness occurs when we fail to detect that an object has moved, changed, or disappeared in some sort of way. And what's especially interesting about this is we have what is called change blindness. We think that if something changed, we'd be able to notice it, and that's especially true if we're warned, but we usually don't. Things change, and even when we're told, we don't notice it. Now, what sort of things will affect change blindness? Well, a couple of different things. If the change is a part of our central attentional focus, we're going to be a lot more likely to notice that, or if it's especially relevant to the story. If it's an irrelevant detail or it wouldn't really change our understanding of the story or it's on the periphery, we're not going to notice it as much. We might notice it a little bit better when we're warned. If we're told ahead of time, hey, something's going to change, that's going to mean that we're going to intentionally look for a particular change. We also will notice changes if, for example, I show you a bowl and then it suddenly changes to a book. You're going to probably notice that a lot more. That is what we call a type change. On the other hand, if a bowl changes color to a different colored bowl, you're going to notice that a little bit less. And this is what we call a token change. So type changes when one item changes from one category to the next tends to be a little bit easier to notice than a token change. And here's some data from Hollingworth and Henderson that does show that in general, it's a lot easier for us to notice type changes versus token changes. We already did our awareness test. This is a case of inattentional blindness. In the original study by Simons and Chabris, students in white shirts and black shirts passed a basketball around, and the participant was instructed to count how many passes the team in the white shirts made, just like we saw in the video with the bear. In the Simons and Chabris study, somebody walking by in a gorilla suit stood in the middle of the frame, beat his chest, and then walked away. 50% of original participants failed to notice that gorilla. So inattentional blindness is when we fail to notice unexpected objects that are appearing in a visual display. And if we weren't completely preoccupied with this other task, it stands to reason that we would notice it. Now, when is inattentional blindness less likely to happen? First of all, you'll be less likely to notice it if we know that something is going to happen. We also know that if the object is similar to stimuli that are relevant to the task, it'll be easier for us to notice the change as well. So if we were asked to count the passes that the team in black shirts made, it's going to be easier for you to notice that bear or gorilla because they share color features in common. So that's really all I had for attention. Don't forget that on Monday we are going to have lab day. We're going to collect our psychophysics data, so don't forget. And I will see you then. Bye.